as we continue on with our learning burst for today. If you have any questions at all, please drop them in the chat. I will try to keep up with the chat for Kyle while he is training us. And as always, he always stops and gives you breaks too. And if you can't put it in the chat, just come off mute and let us know that way if you have something you would like to add or have a question. So without further ado, I will turn everything over to Kyle. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Sharonda. So again, my name's Kyle Hood, and we'll be talking about some helpful and harmful garden critters today. We're keeping it more on the insect side of things and with a little arachnids in here too. So in one of our previous talks, I talked more about deer and mammals in the garden. So we're focusing more on the small things in the garden this week. And I work for the Steps to Health program at North Carolina State University. I really manage all of our garden projects. My official title is the Garden Collaborative Extension Associate there, but that's just some little background about my role. Yeah, so let's jump right into some garden critters, some things you might be seeing in the garden now. Maybe you saw them last spring, or you might see them in the fall, because a lot of these insects that we're going to talk about have multiple life cycles in a year. So, maybe you saw one in April, you'll see it again in October. It's just kind of dependent on what we're talking about. And before we sort of dive into them, I just want to talk about some general things to look for when we're talking about these insects. With the harmful insects that are eating your plants, it's hard to memorize what they look like the first time you see them. So we're going to talk about maybe 10 different ones today. Don't feel like you need to memorize them all, but being able to distinguish little patterns or even how they feed on plants is important. So we'll talk about what their damage on a plant looks like, some special ways you can sort of find patterns in the insects. And so hopefully, don't feel like you have to memorize them all, but we'll kind of give you some clues that maybe next time you see one, you might remember a little bit about it. So this first one we're going to talk about is the cucumber beetle. And in North Carolina, there's mainly two different types. So we have the spotted, which is that picture on the bottom left, and the striped, which is that picture on the bottom right. And it's one of the most common pests you're going to find in the garden. You do not want to see cucumber beetles in your garden for a few different reasons. And they're named cucumber beetles because they love cucumber plants, but really any squash family plant, that cucurbita family, so we're talking pumpkins, squash, zucchini, any of those, they will happily eat the leaves and the fruit of those plants. And I've worked with child care centers in the past that thought the spotted cucumber beetle was a type of ladybug. And you can see where they would get that from. It does not, that one in the bottom left looks similar enough to a ladybug where that's not a crazy conclusion. And so I went to visit their site. They had like 100 of these spotted cucumber beetles all over their garden, just eating everything. But they just didn't realize that it's actually a harmful insect and not a helpful insect. So the main sort of way to remove them is just going to be by hand. And unless you have a huge infestation, just killing them, removing them by hand is going to be enough. If they're just overrunning your garden, you could think about spraying some sort of natural pesticide, but that would be a very last resort. I would just probably never spray a pesticide in a child care center. That's just like a personal policy. But if they're just destroying your garden, that would be the last resort. But usually just removing them mechanically with your hands or with the hands of the children in your center, and even relocating them to, a few miles down the road if you didn't want to kill them, that would be a good way to sort of get rid of them. And usually there's about one generation per year. So some of these we're going to talk about, you might see them at two different times of the year because their life cycle works like that. With these, you'll only see one generation per year. But even so, they'll be here for most of the summer, which is prime time for your squash and pumpkins and all the things they'll be eating. And they're also relatively small, so only about 0.2 inches long. So we're not talking about very big insects. I'm growing squash and pumpkins and watermelons in my garden right now, and I've definitely seen a few. But if I'm just seeing a few, it's not a big issue. I could probably leave them be. The main reason we want to avoid them and get rid of them when we do see them is they are a vector for disease. Specifically, they are a vector for a disease called bacterial wilt. And what bacterial wilt is going to do is it's going to make it seem like your plants are really thirsty. So maybe a third of your squash plant is just going to act really thirsty. All the leaves are going to droop. And then at nighttime, for the first few nights, it'll bounce back and be like, man, that's weird. Maybe I'm not getting enough water in that area. And then eventually it'll stop bouncing back at night. That part of the plant will die. It'll spread to the rest of that plant. So that's sort of the process that bacterial wilt takes on these plants. Pumpkins, it can take 2 weeks. Some squash varieties, it'll kill them in 3 or 4 days. So it just kind of depends. If you can identify bacterial wilt and get the plants out of there, it's not likely it's going to spread to the rest of your pumpkin patch or whatever it is. So getting it out early is important. I would just cut off all the infected parts of that plant, take them out of your garden. Otherwise, these cucumber beetles will be all over that infected area and then spread it even more rapidly. So these are sort of the main disease you need to worry about with cucumber beetles infecting your squash family plants. And this is what their damage looks like, especially in the early summer when there's not fruit on your squash plants. So they'll eat the leaves, and once you sort of, with all these different harmful insects, eventually you can just look at a leaf and give a educated guess on what it is. So you see that specific pattern enough times and you'll just kind of guess it's cucumber beetles. If it's bad enough, you'll just see them on there. But they'll eat leaves and fruit of these squash family plants. Sticking with the predators of squash, this one is much trickier and more interesting in some ways. This is the squash vine borer, and it actually bores into the stems of plants in the squash family. So whether it's pumpkins or cucumbers, really those same Cucurbita family of plants. And what you want to look out for is that same drooping of the leaves. So while it could be bacterial wilt, that drooping is classic of squash vine borer damage too, so it can get a little confusing. And if I see drooping in my leaves, I want to go to nearby stems and investigate them and see if there's holes in those stems. So after these squash vine borers have been feeding on my squash stems for a while, they'll just happily, they're nice and fat, they'll happily burrow into the ground and they'll overwinter, so they'll live all winter underground and they'll sort of pop out next spring as these squash vine borer moths. And these are the moths that are going to lay the eggs for the next generation. So these moths have been laying their eggs right beside your squash plants. And, about the time your squash plants are getting going, that's when they're popping out of the ground, those larvae, and they're drilling into those plants. So you can actually trap these moths. These moths are very easy to spot. Most of the moths we're going to talk about today, I think there's three that we're going to talk about, look very dull, black and brown. They just look like a generic moth. This kind of looks like a tiger. It would be hard to miss this moth if I knew what to be looking for. And again, these moths, they lay the eggs at the base of the host plants, which in this case is my squash and cucumbers and pumpkins, things like that. The damage these,
Kyle,
yes.
you had a question related to the first two beetles, they wanted to know where they actually come from.
Oh, like where in terms of like the process of their life cycle?
Or maybe their orientation. This one, kids are kids. Can you unmute and help us out with the question?
I want
Sorry, I
to
only
know where
have
it
one
come from
screen, so it's
because
hard for me to look at the chat.
Yeah.
What were you
yeah,
gonna say?
I wanted to know where they come from because I had seen some on my garden at home, and are they? I don't know. When we buy the plants, are they first on the plants hiding somewhere, or because
No,
they wasn't?
so with those beetles, they're eating other things like weeds and apple leaves until your squash is ready to go, and then they're gonna come find your squash. So or your cucumbers. So they're just a very common insect that are eating things not in your garden until the time when your cucumbers are ready to go. So it's unlike like if you go, let's say, buy a cucumber plant in a nursery, if you look at it for 3 or 4 seconds and don't see one, they're probably not hiding out on the cucumber plant. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Yes, thank you.
Okay. Okay. So this is squash vine borer damage. It's unlike any other pest damage that I've seen or I can think of. So when I say go look for holes in your squash plants at sort of the stems, the base of the stems, these are the holes you're going to be looking for. And there's this nasty orangish goo that kind of comes when they make these holes. And usually they're not going to be sitting out there for you to see them. When I've seen this in my garden, I actually have to cut my squash vines open to find them and kill them because you do not want them sticking around the next year. Because once they get a foothold in these cucumbers and squash and pumpkins, that plant's done for. My son brought home 2 pumpkin plants from his preschool class that they started in his classroom. He was so excited. This was last year. And his pumpkins got nice and big. The plants were huge. And then one day we realized there was a squash vine borer infestation. At that point, there's nothing you can do except kill the squash vine borers so they don't come back next year. So these these are devastating insects to these plants in this family. But those are the holes you're looking for. They're incredibly obvious once you start looking for them. So if I notice drooping of a section, I'll just go look for holes in that section, remove that section in the squash vine borers, and kind of go from there. I talked about slugs in a previous talk that we did, but I did want to mention them again. Is obviously a harmful insect because they eat the foliage of a lot of different plants. And the main thing with slugs is that they like a very moist and wet environment. So if my garden is not conducive to that, I will likely not have slug issues. For example, if I have a big pile of rocks or sticks right beside my garden bed, the slugs are going to have a nice, safe place to sleep at night, to go to when it's warm outside. And then when it's cool, they'll just go right to my garden and eat my produce and then go right back to that safe space. So making sure there's no brush piles, there's no really obvious places that an animal who hates sunlight could go hide out when it's really sunny. That'll help with slug issues. You can also create slug traps. A very easy way to do this is to just put a few wooden boards beside my garden bed and then lift those wooden boards up after a few days. Most of the slugs in the area will probably be on those wooden boards. Also, if you're feeling adventurous, you can get a flashlight and go out to your garden at nighttime, which is probably when they're feeding, and you'll find a lot of the slugs in the area. Slug damage is pretty obvious. They usually leave like sort of the middle of the leaves intact, almost like an exoskeleton is left over. It's pretty obvious when slugs have been doing their work, especially because they leave a slime trail. If if I'm finding the damage, within a few hours of the slugs being there, they'll leave a nasty little slime trail, and it makes it incredibly obvious that slugs were doing the damage. Again, just picking them off by hand, putting them somewhere else, is usually enough. If you're having really bad slug issues, that's when I would consider trapping them. We've talked about cabbage worms before, but they're one of the worst pests in North Carolina for gardens, especially if I'm growing cole crops like cabbage and kale. They In this picture, you can just barely see that cabbage worm on some red Russian kale. It's because they blend right into kale and cabbage plants, which are two of their favorites. So if you weren't looking for them, you wouldn't see them. But they essentially eat the whole leaf of these plants. A kale leaf, they'll just eat the whole thing down to basically that middle rib, and they'll just kind of leave that most middle rib there. Um, I've been going to some gardens that are at schools that are just kind of being left alone in the summer, because usually that's how school gardens go. And the worst pest damage you see of gardens that are left alone this time of year is cabbage worms that have just feasted on these kale and cabbage plants, leaving not very much left. So what you need to worry about with them is that cabbage white butterflies are actually laying their eggs on the underside of the leaves on these kale and these cabbage plants. And so if I can stop the butterflies from being able to access my kale and my cabbage plants, I can stop the life cycle and really stop any pest damage from them. So an easy way would be to cover it with mesh. There's lots of different lightweight mesh you could put right on top of kale and cabbage plants that you could fit to really any size garden bed very cheaply. There's a thing called a floating row cover, which is a white fabric. It's very lightweight, it's inexpensive, and you could just kind of lay it on your garden bed, maybe have some, metal semicircles, hoops that are just sort of draping over, and that'll keep the butterflies off of my cabbage and kale plants. This is what a cabbage butterfly looks like. If you're paying attention, you will see them all the time. There's not much going on here. They're basically pure white slash yellowish, but they have a very distinct black dot when their wings are closed. And really, they have a few black dots on their wings that they're opened up, but just flying around, it kind of looks like one black dot and a white butterfly. You would be surprised how frequently you actually see them in day-to-day life when you're looking. But they're everywhere at my house. They're by far the most common butterfly I see, maybe because I like to grow a lot of kale and cabbage, so they have a good life cycle at my house. But it's a very common butterfly, and knowing the whole life cycle of these insects definitely helps you understand at least how to stop them. It makes it more interesting for the kids if you can point out the butterfly who's going to lay the eggs that are going to eat your cabbages. That's just an interesting lesson plan for kids. And, really all these insects are their own lesson in themselves. And again, preventing these butterflies from reaching them in the first place is the best way to stop them without spraying something. This is what cabbage worm damage looks like. There's lots of different types of cabbage worms. The ones I showed you earlier were just a solid green color. This variety looks a lot different than that, obviously. It looks like they're eating an actual cabbage plant here, and this is kind of what their damage looks like when they're left to themselves. So they'll take out the large majority of the foliage on any of these plants. I can't really grow kale at my house unless I deal with them, because their numbers are just too large. They're eating so much of my kale leaves. They're laying eggs on the bottom of my kale leaves, so I don't even really want to eat the kale leaves that I can get to because there's eggs underneath. So um, in some parts of North Carolina, they can definitely be devastating. We've talked about flea beetles before, but they're worth mentioning again because, especially in the early garden season and sometimes in their second life cycle in the fall, they can be a big problem in the garden, especially with young plants. So they're incredibly small. They actually look like a flea on the leaf of a plant. And they create very small holes in the plant. And sometimes the holes don't even penetrate the plant. So we'll see some flea beetle damage here in a minute. An organic way you can help deal with them is to put neem oil spray, which is an organic pesticide used specifically for them. This is only if you're having really serious flea beetle issues. I've never had flea beetle issues that were so bad that I needed to do that, but it could definitely help if they're just destroying your crops. One thing that's nice about flea beetles is they're so small that once your plants get big enough, they really don't care about the flea beetle damage anymore. So tomatoes is a great example. Tomatoes, flea beetles love tomato leaves. And when tomatoes are small, when the plants are small, they do sort of hinder their growth. But at a certain point, the tomato plants are just so big that they could care less if the flea beetles are eating 2 or 3 leaves at the bottom of the plant. So um, your plants will sort of outgrow that damage after a while. And they overwinter in weeds, meaning they sort of have eat their fill and then they go sort of hibernate in weeds and debris. So keeping your garden area clean, sort of the same way you do for slugs, is a good way to keep flea beetles from sort of propagating year after year. This is what flea beetle damage looks like. This is one of the most obvious leaves you could look at and say that's a flea beetle, because really it looks like I took an insect-sized shotgun and just shot that leaf. It's just a big spread of small, tiny holes. So once you sort of see flea beetle damage a few times, you'll be able to look at a leaf and say that was probably flea beetles. It's very, very obvious. Aphids are another incredibly small garden pests in North Carolina. They're one of the smallest garden pests you're going to actually see. They're kind of even hard to see their bodies without a magnifying glass. This picture is definitely enhanced. This is not what they look like just with your eyes. But kind of like flea beetles, intervention is rarely necessary. And actually, flea beetles do a lot more damage than aphids. So in most cases, you can just leave aphids alone. If they are overwhelming your plants, which is pretty rare, it is worth getting rid of them, and you could just do that with your hands. I've had instances of aphids on my carrots I had to remove by hand, but when I remove a whole bunch of aphids by hand, they didn't come back. So in rare cases, you would need to have some intervention with them, but most of the time you can just leave them be. And again, they're incredibly small. So we're talking about like 1/16 of an inch to 1/8 of an inch long. So some of the smallest insects we'll be talking about today are aphids. And there are lots of different types of aphids. So here's a completely different looking aphid. We're not going to go over all the types of aphids because that's a whole presentation in of itself, but all aphids will have tailpipes. So on this picture, you can kind of see one of a good clear aphid that has a tailpipe. This top right one, the most top right aphid, he has sort of 2 horns coming off his backside. If you see those sort of tailpipes coming off, you can sort of guess it's an aphid. They can carry some viruses. So if you're really worried about them carrying squash mosaic as a virus they carry, then you could just remove them when you see them by hand. It'll take a very small amount of time because they're so tiny and they kind of clump together. But again, they're usually not a big problem, and actually they are food for a lot of beneficial insects that we're going to talk about now. So if you remove them, you might be sort of cutting into that food source for some of the ones we're going to talk about now. The last thing I'll say about aphids is they shed their skin as they grow, and it usually, what it looks like is almost a white carcass of an aphid. So I was at a garden the other day and I just touched a plant and all this white snow looking stuff just comes flying off this plant. And that's because there was an aphid infestation, and so many aphids shed their skin that when I touched the plant, all those white carcasses fell off. So if you ever see a bunch of these white little things on a plant in the bottom, that's probably aphid residue from an aphid infestation. Aphid damage is minimal. Usually you won't even notice it. If it's really bad, you'll probably see yellowing of leaves as the main symptom, or maybe stunted growth. So if you if you know they're on one of your plants, you see maybe some yellowing of your leaves, that's a good sign that you should get rid of them. So ladybugs or lady beetles, I finally we're at some beneficial insects. And I specifically put these right after aphids because they are notorious for eating aphids and other harmful insects, but specifically they target aphids, and they actually lay their eggs right beside aphids. So when those eggs hatch, those larvae will just be able to munch on those aphids. But there's a lot of different types of lady beetles in North Carolina. The main thing you're looking for, so the classic one we all know is red with black spots and a dome shape, but there's all types of colors and designs. So if you see a rounded sort of dome shaped body, that's a good indication that it's a type of lady beetle. And they're all relatively helpful for your garden. So definitely don't kill any sort of lady beetles you find. They're just going to help your garden. They're going to eat things like aphids, keep those aphids at bay. And again, that's maybe another reason why you shouldn't just indiscriminately kill aphids unless you're seeing issues with them, because they're a food source for some of our beneficial insects. And they're pretty much active the entire growing season in North Carolina. And you've probably had this happen come fall, come maybe October, September, they start looking for a warm place to hibernate and to go inside. And so oftentimes you'll find a big infestation of lady beetles inside your house, crawling through your windows late in the year. And that's really why, is because they're active from spring to fall and they're looking for a place to overwinter. So knowing the different life cycles of even these beneficial insects is important, because if you had no idea what a lady beetle egg or a lady beetle larvae looked like, you'd probably think that larvae, especially the larvae, was doing some harm. It just looks like it's going to hurt something. But that larvae is actually more impactful as a helpful critter than a ladybug, than a mature lady beetle. So the larvae is actually the one that's eating more insects, more aphids, more harmful insects than the mature lady beetle. And again, they're laying those eggs, if they can, right near a colony of aphids. So when those eggs hatch, those larvae pop out and just start munching on aphids. And larvae look a lady beetle larvae look like a lot of different things, but most of them have a sort of taper on the end of their bodies. You can see on this one, the very end is a lot skinnier than the front half. And that's a good sign that you're looking at a lady beetle larvae. But if you don't know what an insect or larvae is, I would probably just leave it alone for the most part. Or you can take a picture of them and send them to your local extension agent. Most counties have an agriculture agent that is happy to look at that for you. Lots of counties have a group of extension master gardener volunteers who one of their main jobs is to look at pictures of pests or insects and help you identify them. You're also welcome to send pictures to me and I can see if I can help you figure out what they are. But and again, lady beetle eggs can be orange, yellow, or red. So they're usually groups of 5 to 20 eggs, all sort of bunched together like you see here. And this is what a lady beetle pupae looks like. And they're just going to sit still in that. until they actually turn into a lady beetle. So you probably won't see these incredibly often, but that is a lady beetle pupa or pupae. And again, their life cycle, much like a lot of these, is from eggs to larvae to pupae to adult. So that's what just a generic lady beetle pupae looks like. There's lots of different looking ones. That's just kind of one for you to see. Some more beneficial bugs and some more exciting bugs for young children particularly. So this is an assassin bug. And assassin bugs are a big group of insects that are predatory, that eat a lot of the harmful insects we've talked about. They're going to eat aphids, they're going to eat beetles, they're going to eat caterpillars. They sometimes eat helpful insects too. That's not enough reason to remove them or get rid of them, but they're very helpful. And in North America, there's over 150 different species of assassin bugs. This is actually a wheel bug. It's a type of assassin bug called a wheel bug, and you can kind of see on its back is essentially a wheel. It looks like at least half of a wheel on its back. But again, they are one of the more interesting bugs to see. They're a lot larger than almost any of the other insects you're going to see in your garden. So they're very obvious when they're there. Kids definitely like looking at them. They're very interesting, especially if you can find one that's in the process of eating something. It looks like this assassin bug has found a beetle to eat. And here's another picture of a wheel bug. This is in their sort of adolescent stage, their nymph stage. So when they're adults, they have wings. This is sort of a smaller version, but even the nymphs are still going to be helpful in eating. That's actually eating a potato beetle larvae, I believe that's what that is. So potato beetles are notoriously annoying pests for potato crops. So it's helping a lot there. And they actually use their saliva to paralyze the insects that they find. So that's kind of an interesting thing about them. And their two front legs are called raptorial front legs, which is kind of the same idea for the two front legs of a praying mantis. But again, these are two of the more interesting, um, helpful critters you're going to see in your garden. Lacewings are another helpful critter you'll see. You can see why they're called lacewings. Their wings kind of look a little bit like dragonfly wings, but even more lacy and translucent. This is a green lacewing. There's also brown lacewings in North Carolina. I believe there's more than just those two, but those are the two you'll probably see the most. And they also eat harmful garden pests, specifically aphids. A lot of these helpful insects rely on aphids as a big part of their food source. So when I was hammering home that probably killing aphids the first time you see them isn't a great idea, that's why. It's because it's a critical food source for a lot of these different helpful insects. But just like the lady beetle, the larvae stage actually eats the most insects. So here you can see the larvae stage of a lacewing, and they're actually called aphid lions. They look similar to the larvae stage of a ladybug, but they're tapered at both ends, and they look a little bit more like an alligator is how people describe them, but they're affectionately referred to as aphid lions because once they get going, they just munch on aphids all day and protect your garden that way. Their eggs are very distinct. They have these sort of little almost wires on them to protect them from predators. So if you ever see almost floating eggs with these little strings attached to them, you can probably bet those are lacewing eggs. But again, knowing the full life cycle of even the beneficial insects is important because if you saw that lacewing larva slash aphid lion in your garden, that just looks like it's harmful, but really it's harmful to the things that you want out of your garden. So um, understanding their full life cycle is helpful and also educational for the children working in the garden too. This is a cutworm. So we're back to the harmful insects. Cutworms are incredibly harmful. These are about 2 inches long at sort of maximum size. So they're one of the bigger worms you're going to see in your garden. When you touch them, they immediately recoil and make a C shape. So if you're not sure if it's a cutworm, you could just touch one, and if they automatically roll up into a ball, that's a good sign you have a cutworm on your hands. There's actually a wide variety of colors. This is a brown cutworm. These are the ones that are most common near my house. And their body's very smooth. So some caterpillars are very hairy. Cutworms have very little hair. If you're touching them or looking at them, you're not going to see very much hair. So that's another sort of giveaway that we're looking at a cutworm. And then the damage they cause is very unique. They wrap their body around the stem and effectively cut the stem off. So you might go out to your garden one day and have a lot of little seedlings, maybe a lot of little cucumber seedlings that you were really excited about. And it looks like some kid came and just cut them all with scissors. That's what cutworm damage looks like. So the first time this ever happened to me, I was so confused until I actually realized what did it, which was, again, a cutworm. And this is a cutworm moth. So obviously the adult stage of the cutworm that's going to lay those eggs. It's actually going to lay hundreds of eggs at a time in the ground around those plants that it thinks are a good host for its future generations. Usually, even though they're laying hundreds of eggs at a time, the actual numbers that reach it to the cutworm stage are not very many. So removing them by hand when you do see them is often enough. I've never seen a cutworm infestation. If it did come to that, there are definitely some ways you could deal with that, but usually just using your hands is plenty. This moth is one of the more tricky ones to identify because it's very basic. We're looking at mostly black and brown. If you saw that outside, you just think that's just another moth. But if you find cutworms, that's a good reason to start looking for those black and brown moths that are, again, kind of hard to differentiate from just your average moth.
Kyle,
Yeah.
I think right before you hit cutworms, there was a question. There you go. And it said, are they harmful to humans, the lacewings?
If you ate one?
No, it says, are they harmful to humans?
Oh, okay. Yeah. No, you shouldn't worry about lacewings for humans because they're so small. I mean, even if they did bite you, nothing would happen. I think every single one of these helpful insects and critters in here, there's really no reason to worry about it for humans, but except for some spiders, which we'll talk about. But yeah, I would not worry about them for humans. I will say though, and I was going to say this later, that if you haven't noticed a trend here, a lot of this action, whether it's the cutworms or these aphids or the eggs, it's all happening on the leaves for the most part. And so just be really careful. Let's say I'm growing kale or something and I just harvest a bunch of it. Even if I'm not spraying anything on it, if I know that, it's safe from pesticides and things like that, wash it thoroughly because you will have eggs and insect residue and insects who have been fighting and battling on those leaves. So even if you have an organic garden, make sure you wash especially leaves very thoroughly because you might just accidentally eat a bunch of insect eggs or even some worms you didn't realize were there. And that's not really how you want to, have your salad or whatever it is. This is
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. This is cutworm damage. This is a classic example of it. Essentially, that cutworm wrapped its body around that stem, fed on the stem until it took over the whole plant, knocked it down. When they get a little bigger, they'll crawl up your plants and cut higher stems off, which is a little better for your plant because your plant can recover from losing, one stem up here. But when it cuts off the main stem, obviously that plant's done for. So they can really hurt your new seedlings when they're really getting at the base of the plant and just chopping them off. Another harmful insect is the tomato hornworm. One of the more interesting looking worms you're going to see. It's by far the biggest worm that we've talked about today. The big ones can be 4 inches long, and it has those distinctive horns in the back of its abdomen. It's hard to miss, except that its favorite plant is a tomato. And if you just look at it, it blends right in with those tomatoes. So if you're not paying extra close attention to your tomato plants, they can do a lot of damage before you notice them, even though they're huge. So again, they mainly feed on the leaves of tomatoes, but they will eat the fruit too if you let them stick around long enough. And they live in the ground over winter as a pupae and emerge the next spring as a moth. So they'll feed on your tomatoes, they'll go sort of hibernate in the ground as in that pupae form, and next spring they'll pop out ready to lay some eggs on some of these host plants. So a lot of these harmful insects have very similar life cycles, um, which makes them a little bit more interesting. And again, they can get up to 4 inches, so they're by far the biggest worm we've talked about today. I think cutworms were second biggest at maybe 2 inches, but these are much bigger and fatter. This is a tomato hornworm moth, so it actually is pretty distinct in that it has those orange sort of circles on its abdomen. So that definitely separates it from other moths that you'll see, and it it's not too generic so you wouldn't notice. So if you're looking for it, mainly look for those orange circles in the abdomen. Besides that, it's mainly just black and brown, like your more generic moth. But unlike a lot of these, they do have 2 generations in a year. So we just talked about the generation that burrows all winter and then comes up in the spring as a moth. Well, it does that same life cycle again in between that. So once in the midsummer, you're going to have one generation, and again after that. So they sort of pack it in there, and there's usually not so many hornworms that you need to do anything but remove them by hand, which is kind of the same for a lot of these. If you're looking at tomatoes twice a week is what I would do, just looking for hornworms or insect damage. That's probably an adequate amount to stop them from hurting your tomato plants too much. So checking your plants twice a week, keeping an eye out for those hornworms. And again, just like the cabbage loopers, if I'm not actually looking for them, I probably won't see them because they're the same color as the plant they're on. This is what hornworm damage looks like. They pretty much eat everything besides that main stem. So they're eating the leaves, they're eating the side shoots. This is a classic example of what their damage looks like. And you can imagine if you had 3 or 4 of them on one tomato plant, after a week, you wouldn't have much tomato plant left. So just keeping an eye on your tomatoes, again, twice a week, probably during the growing season, is more than adequate. And honestly, I've only ever seen maybe 3 or 4 in my garden in one season where I live. So their numbers usually do not get to a very, large amount, so it becomes a catastrophe. So a beneficial insect is a parasitoid wasp, and they're actually a massive group of wasps that use other insects as a vehicle to lay their eggs. And you might have seen this on your tomato plant before. This is a parasitoid wasp that laid its eggs on a hornworm, killing the hornworm, and now it's acting as its host vehicle for its next generation in life. So a very interesting insect that helps you in the garden. They can also use aphids as a vehicle to lay their eggs. They can use some types of beetles. So they're actively hunting, killing lots of harmful insects and using their bodies as the host for their eggs. Um, if you see one of these in your garden, obviously that's a great sort of mini lesson to do with your class, just to talk about what happened, the life cycle of, these parasitoid wasps. They're very hard to identify, so I didn't even put like a generic picture on here because there's so many different kinds, but they don't really look like a wasp that you'd imagine in your head when you think about a wasp. So I do have a picture of one kind. Again, we're talking about like over 100 different kinds. This is a picture of one type of these wasps. And again, it's not that classic picture of a wasp you'd think of. They have lacy wings, really small appendages, but there's they come in all shapes and sizes. The ones that hunt aphids are much smaller, as aphids are much smaller. The one that hunt hornworms are bigger, so all shapes and sizes. More worry about if you see one of those hornworms or maybe an aphid that has eggs on them, that's probably what happened, is that one of these wasps came, laid their eggs, and killed that insect in the process. So the last one we're going to talk about today is spiders, and lots of people are scared of spiders. So if you or one of the children in your childcare center are definitely afraid of spiders, can't work in a garden where spiders are, that's a reason to remove them from your garden. But that's about the only reason you should remove them from your garden, because they're probably the best hunters of anything we've talked about today. They actually eat as many pounds of insects a year as people eat of meat. So that's hard to even fathom that, but spiders are doing an excellent job of keeping insects out of your garden. So if I have a garden spider, a wolf spider, really any non-poisonous spider in my garden is a good thing. And I would just completely leave them alone, let them keep doing their job. The poisonous spiders you want to worry about in North Carolina are the black widow and brown recluse. And if I'm in my garden bed, just a regular garden, am unlikely to find those two varieties in there. They're going to be in the same places a snake would be, or even a slug would be. So you're going to find a brown recluse and black widow like under a pile of rocks or sticks or in a brush pile or underneath something. But just out in the open in my raised bed, it's unlikely that I'd find those two. Not to say you shouldn't be paying attention, because obviously they're poisonous, they're dangerous, but it's very unlikely that I would just find a poisonous spider in my garden. The large majority of the ones I find in my garden are perfectly harmless and helping me control aphids and beetles and all these insects we've talked about. And we haven't even scratched the surface of the insects we could talk about today, because this could be a 10-hour presentation. So the gist of it is spiders are very beneficial. Leave them alone unless you literally just can't stand being around spiders. And then I would try to remove it safely without killing them if you can. So just some sort of general things to recap. My sort of main thing is give nature a chance to fight back. So that's kind of where that aphid example comes in. If I have some aphid issues that aren't hurting my plants yet, give those insects that are going to eat the aphids a chance to come. And if maybe they see them that first year, they'll get used to coming back over and over. So now I've created an answer to my aphid problem. And that goes for a lot of these, but aphids are just a really good example. So give the other insects a chance to get in there before I just start spraying pesticides and killing everything. So that would be my first tip. We talked about this earlier, but make sure you wash the leaves of produce especially well. I think every single, at least 3 or 4 of these insects laid eggs on the bottom of the leaves. and they like to feed in the bottom of the leaves. So again, if I just take my kale, I might be taking 15 eggs and 3 caterpillars with me. And if I'm not washing it thoroughly, they'll end up in my salad. So even if I have a purely organic garden, definitely wash your produce really well, even if it's just to get bugs off and eggs off, because that's where insects are laying them for the most part. And again, if you're unsure of an insect, take a picture, send it to your local extension office. A lot of your counties have extension master gardeners who part of their job is to look at those pictures and help you identify what it is, if it's helpful or harmful. I'm also happy if you send me a picture to see if I can help out with it as well. And now it's time for questions, but if you wanted to email me after this and just ask me some questions or just chat about your garden space, I'm more than happy to have a phone call and help out in any way I can. But that's my email address for you all to reach me at a later date. But if you have any questions, feel free to ask me now or over email later. I did catch all the questions in the chat, Sharonda, right? Yeah, I think we're caught up. Yeah.
I have a question.
Hey, Cassandra.
Is there
Yes,
any
ma'am.
way is there any way we could get a copy of this presentation so that we can maybe see all the bugs? I mean,
Yeah, you
or
can
have
have it.
something to reference to?
I'll send it to Sharonda right after this, and y'all can have it. I don't mind at all.
Oh, perfect. Thank you.
And
I
Kyle,
will.
I have to tell you, the hawthorn, tomato hawthorn, for me, that was called a tobacco worm. That's
Yeah. Okay.
where
So
I grew up seeing them. Huh?
yeah, it can be. Yeah, it's the hornworm or tobacco worm, and people don't grow
Yeah.
tobacco now, Sharonda. So I think that that might be part of the reason. But yeah,
Oh,
it's both those names.
no, down here they do. Where I
Okay.
am, there's a lot of tobacco fields right now still, and I still think about that because I know that that's a part of my fear of snakes and worms because of being in tobacco field and how they would throw they were literally were kids, so they're throwing them on each other and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah, those worms are a little
And
creepy.
I
They're
have to
big.
ask Miss Crystal, if you can check the chat for me, please. Anyone else have any questions for Kyle?
Yes, this is Crystal. I have a question. My question is, I had a hard time logging in at first and getting into the Zoom, and I came in
Okay.
right when you were talking about cabbage beetles. Was there anything before that?
Let's see. So I was talking about cabbage worms, probably. Let's see.
I thought it was beetles. Was it cabbage beetles or was it cabbage worms?
So we talked about cabbage worms. We talked about cucumber beetles.
Cucumber beetles. Sorry, cucumber beetles. Yeah. Was there
So
anything before that?
you're fine. That was the first thing. So you came in at the perfect time.
Perfect. Okay. All right. And I will check the chat. Thank you.
Thank you. But please also know I will send out Kyle's slides like he just said and the recording as well, just in case you want to go back, to verify also. Okay, Miss Crystal? And anyone else too, if you feel that you may have missed something in the beginning. Thank you, ma'am. Does anyone else have any more questions in regards to our critters in the garden? If not, we will see Kyle again next week.
One more
Oh, Miss
question.
Crystal
Sorry.
has go ahead. Yes.
Sorry. Okay, so Kyle mentioned about taking a lot of these bugs off with your hands. Well, one, I'm not going to do that, but two, um, if you take a lot of them off with your hands, where is the best place to put them so that they don't return?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, let's say they're at your childcare center.
Mhm.
I could put them in a plastic container. I could I could take them a mile away on my drive home and just dump them out in some grass. You know what I
Okay.
mean? So I
Okay.
think that'd be totally almost like I have a possum problem at my house. I'm just taking my possum so far away that he can't make it back. I think that's totally fine. I don't love killing any of this stuff, with a few exceptions because they're very annoying. But so yeah, I think just taking it a mile or two down the road, maybe it's on your commute home, little green space, just dump them all together. That's totally fine.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Please feel free. If not, you can always email myself or Kyle with questions that you may have. And next week, we will talk about composting and watering our gardens. Okay, that was another big issue that a lot of teachers were bringing to us. So, those two topics, composting and watering of the garden. Okay. So we are 3 minutes before the top of the hour. If there are no more questions, please make sure you have signed in into the chat. That is how I do your certificates. First and last names into the chat, please, and then I can do your certificates. So make sure that has happened. And other than that, you are free to go. And I'll just leave it on a little bit just to make sure that everybody has put their information in the chat.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much. And thank you, Kyle, as always.
It's always fun.
All right. Okay, it looks like I have everybody in the chat because it slowed down. So with that being said, I will log everybody off.